Welcome to the Functional Herbal Medicine Podcast. We're your hosts, Kristin and David. Our podcast is all about discussing a functional approach to herbs and healing, and to share our practical tools that you can use in your everyday life to become your own best healer. So this episode, we are talking about using herbs for colds and flus. We'll take you through all the stages from prevention to what to do when you actually get sick, and then onto the recovery process. We're going to talk about the trendy things that we see going around that actually from a herbalist perspective don't quite make sense, and some of the things that are actually making it harder for your body to clear and recover from a cold and flu. So I think it's going to be a good one. Let's get into it. Where should we begin? I think it's cold and flu season now, although it seems like it never really ended. Do you have anything to say about that? Like, what have you seen through the summer and like going into the fall?
Totally. Yeah. I mean, ultimately, I've been practicing for 3 or 4 years, and usually you see cycles and patterns with things. And this year was completely different. I mean, we just had cold and flu blends all the way through July. I mean, it was a weird climate here for that part of the year, but I don't associate cold and flus necessarily to climate only. We had rain up until July here, and usually it's like cold and flu season tends to follow the winter and the fall. Some suspect like vitamin D, some suspect less sunshine, not the vitamin D component, but more of like that cold dampness opens up the door for sickness. And so it was longer in that regards in our climate, but it was weird. It's not normal from the 4 or 5 years that I've been practicing. What about you? Did you see anything in your practice and your clinic as well?
Well, totally. I mean, I think like we saw people come in all summer long with colds and flus. I actually think that I saw more people looking for cold and flu support in like July and August than I did in September and all of October so far. So it's definitely been a weird year, and like people seem to be presenting in a weird way too. It's not like typical colds and flus. We're seeing like a lot of neurological stuff, and we're definitely seeing a lot of people like with lingering things. So earlier on in the year, we saw people who are coming in with coughs that had been lasting like a whole year. And yeah, I mean, unfortunately it took them a whole year to find herbal support. And I think that we were able to help them pretty quickly, but yeah, like these things are definitely lingering on. So it's been a weird one, and we're like almost end of October, and I feel like I've just been waiting. I'm like waiting for the sick people to come in, and they're not coming in. So I don't know what's going on this year. It's definitely a weird one.
Yeah, yesterday was the first time since, like you said, September. I had a dad come in yesterday with a little baby, probably about 14 months, maybe just 12 months, as young baby. But he's finally come in. He's like, both my kids are sick. They've been they got sick at daycare, then they got better. So when they got better, they went back to daycare. Then they got sick right again. And it was just like their kids have been sick 3 times over the course of this time. But what's interesting, maybe people are getting sick, but they're not coming in for cold and flu remedies. And it's hard to gauge that, because we did see it all summer long, and then kind of it just drops off, which I'm like, are people not getting sick? But it's going around, it's out there. And I mean, we can talk more about the kids stuff and how it's kind of presenting later in the podcast. That's kind of what we have it structured as. But yeah, I mean, ultimately, what the big topic is coronaviruses, but maybe you can kind of elaborate and break down more of the virus and what we're seeing beyond just coronaviruses, or what's out there, what we learned in school.
Totally. So, yeah, there's like in the last few years, we've been totally freaked out about this coronavirus. There are many coronaviruses. So, honestly, the testing isn't perfect. So even when someone says I tested positive for coronavirus, you still don't even know if it's COVID-19 or what, because there's actually so many different strands of it, and it goes around every single year, and it also adapts and changes every single year. That's why you are able to keep getting sick with it, because it essentially evades your immunity if you are if it's changing and adapting every single year. I also think I don't know, some of the language that we use around corona or around viruses, it's very much like it attacks us. And I mean, I don't love to like navigate my world in this way that like, oh, anything could kind of just come and like settle in my body and take me down. So I don't know. I think that we have a virome. It's sort of a part of our life. It's a part of our, I mean, it's part of the world's biome. So I just want to say it's not something to necessarily be afraid of, and there are many different variations. So just because you're getting sick does not mean that it is going to be the worst possible version of it. It doesn't mean it's even going to like take you down. So, what are your thoughts around that? Like, it seems like we've made this really, really big deal out of this one virus. Seems like there's lots of things that can go around, and what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, coronaviruses, out of all of the viruses that are out there, is probably the most, I don't want to say benign, because we actually present with the cold and flu symptoms, like the runny nose, the fever. I mean, we'll get into this further, but all of that is the way for the body to cleanse and detox. So it's not really the virus that's causing this. It is the virus causing it, but it's the body's reaction, which is a super healthy response. But yeah, coronavirus, out of all of the viruses that could possibly get us, is probably the most common and most benign. And then, this variation, like, we're not going to go too far down the rabbit hole on that. COVID-19, the specific SARS-CoV-2 is the one that they're saying that is more likely to cause serious outcomes. But I remember looking it up. There's like 150 different types of coronaviruses alone, let alone like rhinovirus, influenza virus, polio virus is another one. There's I'll give you one little tidbit on viruses. I've done a lot of research on this with having children. I did a big project on it in school. Polio virus, for example, if you go to Merck manual, so this is one of like the leading doctors, this is like their manual that they use for studying. They say specifically in their manual that like about 65% of people that caught the polio virus, the one that causes paralysis, presented with little to no symptoms whatsoever. And so that tells you right there that poliovirus is way different than we imagine in our heads. And that's kind of what you were speaking on with coronavirus, that we've created this new language or new image of coronavirus, that it's this big boogeyman, when in reality, people are affected, but it's usually people with compromised immunity. They have comorbidities, which means they just have secondary conditions. Those are the people that are affected usually more by the influenza, SARS-CoV-2, polio virus. That one I won't go too down. I mean, I'd like to do my own podcast on we can do one on just the polio virus specifically, because that changes the language dramatically when I talk with people about it, because most people think, oh, you caught polio, that means you became paralyzed, and that's just not what the statistics, the science has shown. So coronavirus to me is very benign in the sense that it presents very serious for a very small fraction of people.
Mm-hmm. That's an awesome example with the polio virus. I think that's really, really interesting, because it is one of those that we just assume is like kind of a death sentence. Like, you get polio and you're paralyzed, and that's kind of it for you. So it definitely highlights the like varying risks, varying degrees. Maybe viruses don't exactly work the way that the mainstream media likes to present them, and we can definitely see that with COVID when we talk about like the at-risk populations. And so like it's interesting, like we operate on this like quote unquote germ theory where if you haven't heard of what germ theory is, it's the way that we totally operate. We think like, oh, things are, viruses or germs could be on this surface. Let's sanitize it. Let's stay away from each other. Let's mask. Like this is like basically everyone is at equal risk of catching and getting sick from this thing. But really, like in the even the mainstream will have a little bit of terrain theory in it because there is like a there's varying degrees of risk. We do understand that there is higher at-risk populations, like you mentioned, like the immune compromised, obesity, underlying conditions. All of these things can contribute to greater sickness, greater risk. So this is kind of, and if you haven't heard of terrain theory, it is this idea that is your body, the state of your body, the quote unquote terrain is the determinant for whether you are going to be able to kind of fight this off if you've caught it, or even the likelihood of catching something. Because we kind of forget, that it's not just as simple as being exposed to something and you're sick. Like that's kind of it, right? But really, the virus has to evade a whole bunch of different things in order for it to get comfortable in your body and multiply, right? If you breathe it in, one, it has to get through your lungs, it has to get into your mucosa, which you have a ton of immune cells there, and then it has to actually get into a cell. When we learn little bits of virology in school, they kind of say like the virus has to like trick its way in, and it's like what? What does that even really mean? Like, how is it doing this? So obviously there's ways that that things get into our cells, but it's not as simple as you're exposed and then you're sick. There's a process through which it has to occur, right? It has to get into your body somehow. So there's actually plenty of points at which you can strengthen your body in order to reduce the likelihood that that virus is going to be able to get inside and then begin to multiply.
Totally. I mean, one example I can think of that what has happened over the past couple years in a hardcore way, but even before that it's existed, is the over sanitization of our hands. This hand sanitizer thing that we're doing. This is probably the most like superficial example of terrain theory, which I'm going to ask you a question on like internally, and so you can tell us more. But superficially, we have always bacteria, viruses, all that stuff is on our hands, and that's kind of like the initial contact for our body to like be able to know what the environment is and what to fight against and what it doesn't need to fight against. And with this over hand sanitizing, what we're seeing a huge increase in like eczema. People have eczema all over their hands, and it's because their body is becoming, their hands are becoming weaker to their environment, and any new thing, whether it's pollen, dust, you name it, anything that comes around and hits the hand, the body's having an allergic response to, an immune response to attack, like, oh, that's bad, we have to go for it, versus recognizing like, oh, this is my environment, I'm always around this, so therefore it's safe, it doesn't hurt me. But how can you, like, maybe you can elaborate further on like terrain theory internally, because that's very easy to think about, hand sanitizer on hands, terrain being my body. But what about internally? Like maybe you can describe some of that mucosa in the digestive tract, or even in the respiratory system, stuff like that.
Mm-hmm, for sure. So we have mucous membranes all in our mouth, our sinuses, all the way down our digestive tract. So basically from mouth and nose to anus, we have mucosa. This is like loaded with immune cells and lymphatic tissue. And essentially, if these are healthy and functioning, we have basically a barrier. It's like kind of like the fort outside the community. It's like the thing that's on the lookout, waiting for waiting for an enemy to come in. So they line the whole digestive system, and anything that you come into contact with, it's going to check. It's going to say, is this safe? Is this not safe? And then we have certain cells in place that will actually like engulf those or like destroy them in some way. So if we have an intelligent immune system and we have proper barriers in place, then we are less likely to have any sort of micro evade that process. So creating a strong terrain, our cells, what do they need? They need a clean environment, they need food, they need water. And so if we can, one, maintain that for them, so feeding ourselves well, getting clean food, clean water, and then also being able to like detoxify. This is not a detox thing. It's like an all year round, like keeping a clean and healthy body. When I say clean, I don't necessarily mean sanitized clean. I mean like, certain pollutants that are in our environment, pesticides and herbicides in the food, where you can minimize that, that's going to minimize what's gunking up your system, essentially. And then also creating strong and healthy barriers. This is really well done through herbs. So we have mucous membrane tonics, and these will essentially like knit together, create stronger barriers in the body, but they also have to be moisturized. So dry, cracked barriers are ineffective barriers. So making sure that there's a balance between kind of like the moisture within your system as well as like the tone aspect. So I think these are important parts of prevention. This was kind of like the first step, I would say, for people to look at. Prevention is your best medicine, and that really comes from having like a healthy terrain. So some of my favorite herbs that I would say like get on now so that you are healthy throughout the whole winter is something like astragalus. Boosts the immune system in the way that it actually builds the white blood cell count. In Chinese medicine, we say it tonifies qi, so it actually just raises overall vitality in the body. And in clinical studies, it's been shown to both reduce the likelihood of getting sick and then the duration. So taking something like that regularly throughout the winter, that will inherently improve your terrain. Mushrooms as well, so things like reishi and turkey tail, these modulate the immune system, so they're safe if you have like autoimmune stuff. So if your immune system is a little bit too on the kind of like too high alert, these things will kind of bring them down into a more manageable place where it's actually like they kind of educate your immune system in a way where it says like, hey, like we don't need to be all the way up here. Let's bring it like this is where the healthy level is. And then there's other things like echinacea that can help bring that up. Actually, astragalus is kind of like that too, kind of like bring it up. So if you're in the deficient place and you're sick all of the time, the mushrooms will modulate that and bring that back up as well. So I would say like that's kind of like our basis for terrain, and just to reiterate, like the whole point of doing that is so that you have a strong and healthy body, and then when when you come into contact with something, the likelihood of you catching it is lower. And if you do catch it, the recovery process is easier because you have that energy within your body and that vitality within your body that allows you to deal with stressful situations, deal with hard times, and then be able to actually bounce back.
Definitely. Yeah, one misconception that I see out there with our adaptogens that you're mentioning, like the reishis, astragaluses, they quite often you can go to like web pages and I don't know if they're not herbalists, or I don't know I can't say anybody specifically, I wouldn't either, but they tend to say they're like, stay away from them. They're immunostimulants. They're going to stimulate your immune system, and if you have an autoimmune condition, it can make it worse. And it's very linear in its perspective, similar to what you were saying earlier with like coronaviruses. It's very linear that it's like all coronavirus is bad, and all adaptogens, they modulate, they go up and down. We even have an immunostimulant called cat's claw, and it's specifically on our text as a stimulant, but we've successfully used it for rheumatoid arthritis patients, and it's actually modulated as well. So even that one that's called a stimulant is actually modulatory, and that we as herbalists, that's where we go really in depth. We can look at like, TH1, TH2. Some of you might understand what that means. However, this is just one aspect of the immune system that we would modulate with adaptogen herbs. So I wanted to elaborate on that there's some misconception about adaptogens out there, and we use them quite frequently. They're very effective. Do you want to kind of talk a little bit about like bacteria and its role with like the mucous membranes, and how like that symbiotic relationship is with terrain theory as well?
Sure. So I'm not sure if you had like specific things in mind. So if you do, then definitely elaborate. But I would say, just based off what you said, like microbes are our friends. We live symbiotically within them. If you think about the word like antibiotic, in terms of you get an infection and you take an antibiotic, like what that word actually means is like anti-life, right? So like,
Yep.
It's part of us, and we wouldn't exist without microbes. We actually have more, I think it's like more microbial cells in our body than actually human cells. So we are vastly microbial, and they do so much for us. So you wouldn't digest your food properly without them. You wouldn't actually have the same mental health without them. You wouldn't have the same functions in your body without them. So they're super, super important to not just your immune system, but all of the functions in your body. This is not something that we want to get rid of. So, I think in terms of the immune function, they are totally our friends, and they're actually part of like a cell cleanup crew. That's kind of how I see them. They help to degrade, like what do they do in nature? They help to degrade old cells. They do actually the same thing in your body. So when there's old stuff that needs to be removed, they actually help to metabolize and remove that. In that way, they are, essentially an important part of the immune system. Do you have anything in particular you were thinking of?
I just reflect like when you're in the clinic and working, like you focus a lot on that with many things, not just even cold and flus. Like you go down to the microbe level quite often with many different conditions. So I wanted you just to kind of elaborate for people that that's just as an important role for our normal health, is that if we don't have a good bacteria, then that weakens us more than makes us stronger. And we saw that with doctors over the past few years with over-prescribing antibiotics, and now we have like this MRSA running rampant in hospitals. I mean, hospitals are probably the most sanitized place in all the environment, but it's also the most likely place that you're going to get one of the worst infections possible. Which, on a different topic, different podcast, I've been seeing a lot of that come through the clinic too, with people getting weird infections that won't go away, and it's all post coming from hospitals as well. So that's a different immune thing. It's not cold and flu, but it is immune related too.
That's an interesting point, because like how you brought up the eczema earlier, like with the sanitizing of your hands, it's like when we decimate our own microbial populations, we create space for something we don't want to move in. Or so on one lens it could be that we create space, and on the other lens it could be that we actually change our bodies to make them less habitable to the good things and make them more habitable to the things we don't want. So
Totally.
and that essentially comes down to like eating good food, taking care of your digestive system. Like take care of your body and your body will take care of you.
There's a whole psychological aspect that I always try to apply to what we do, and there's obviously this disconnect with nature that we have. We are disconnected from our environment. I mean, look at the cities we live in. We have trees and birds here and there, but really, like, we're in this concrete jungle. We're so disconnected from nature that we're out of symbiotic relationship with it, and we see ourselves separate from it. And then you can like scale that. So that's a bigger scale, us as humans walking around on the earth. Then you scale that down to like the microbial level, and we kind of have the same thing going. Like I mean, I don't want to say conditioned, but the education that we received as children in our generation growing up was like, always clean your hands, get rid of microbes, they're bad, germs, dirty. Like dirty, that term I try to change at my house, because we'll say, oh, your hands are dirty, go wash them. But in reality, dirt isn't necessarily bad. Wrong dirt, if you're dipping your hands in like swamp water, that might be a bad thing. But like always saying dirty as a bad thing is different than like your hands aren't clean. So that psychological aspect that we're in a sense going this holistic model that you've been mentioning, that this preventative medicine is the returning back to trusting in our bodies, trusting in nature, using plants rather than pharmaceuticals. Like this is moving back psychologically to reconnect. And to make one more point, there was it was a podcast I was listening to, and they're talking about different psychologists and quotes and all this stuff. But there's this idea that because of the cataclysm that happened, however long ago, the flood, that flood myth that's in all these traditions around the world, that's where the psychic schism happened, and where we began to see that the mother no longer takes care of us. Like we were always connected with the earth and us worked together, and then this cataclysm happened. Whatever, the flood, that can be argued and debated what caused it, but there's obviously a story in many traditions about it. And at that point, that's when we step back and we're like, oh, the mother earth actually might harm me. And that's when we kind of started pulling ourselves away from being connected with nature, and then started going our own way. And we've gone so far that we're at the point of antibiotics and hand sanitizer, and we're making that full circle back. Like life isn't linear. We're cycling back. And all the research that you kind of share with me at the shop about terrain and germ theory is kind of, that's it right there, because it's getting rid of that microbe aspect and getting into like reconnecting with nature.
Totally. And like nothing in nature is inherently good or bad, right? Like if you've ever watched a nature show on TV, it's like, like the predators eat the prey and the prey forage on the land. And it's sort of like, you might see something and be like, oh, poor creature. But it's like something has to eat for it to live. And in that way, everything maintains a balance. When we let the ecosystem do what it's supposed to do, and that can look a little messy sometimes, but there is a balance within the creatures that take up that ecosystem. So in Victoria, we have like tons and tons of deer, right? We have deer everywhere. Like I see deer every single day, I think. And it's because we've actually messed up the ecosystem. Like we've moved into their environment. We've chased away their predators. And so now they eat our vegetable gardens like crazy. And so people have to block them out and whatever, but it's like we've changed the terrain. And now we have a quote unquote pest. People who don't live in Victoria will not understand that here people see deer as pests. And this is kind of like what I think like infections are. And it's like we've shifted the ecosystem in the body to allow something to overgrow. We've changed the balance of nature. And so I really like the point that you make, which is like essentially the returning to nature, the returning to balance is going to be part of the key that gets us to be healthier humans, and to be able to move forward in our humanness in a healthy way, to be able to have healthy children and healthy generations after us. It's like we have to move closer to nature instead of further from nature. And some of the messaging that we've had in the last few years has really been like anti-nature. Be afraid of things. And yeah, I think it's such a shame that people are living their lives that way now. And the more that we can come together and embrace each other and embrace the complexity of life and nature and, find our true place in the ecosystem instead of just like bullying our way through, which is what humans like to do. They like to say that, this is ours and we're separate. Our world and animals are totally a different thing, but we're human animals, so. So like with that return to nature, I think is super, super important to create healthy humans. So let's get
Definitely.
into like oh, sorry, did you have something you want to say?
Nope, I was just agreeing with you.
Okay,
Perfect.
cool. Let's get into like what do you do if you're sick? So you get sick. What are your first moves? You feel it settling in your body, you're feeling a little tired, maybe you feel it in your lungs, you're getting the sniffles. Like, what's your first move as a herbalist?
Uh, yeah, usually I play, the kids are usually the first ones to get sick. Because their immune systems are just starting to learn and just they're more susceptible because their body hasn't come into contact with as many things as mine has. So once I see them get sick, that's when I start moving into my world. I've been doing a lot of the mushrooms actually. As soon as we get to cold and flu season, I do that preventatively. They do so many other things than boost the immune system. Like it's good for my heart, good for my liver, good for blood sugar regulation. So I do those, and once I notice the kids are getting sick, I then move into echinacea. And something that's not herbal, but I did read some research was vitamin C, high dose vitamin C as soon as you know that you're gonna get sick or you are feeling sick, you do high dose vitamin C, and it's like 2 grams a day minimum, and you can go even higher than that. You can go pretty high with vitamin C, and so I'll do that. I'll throw back a couple pills of vitamin C. Caveat on that though, if you say you've kind of went beyond that point of knowing that you're getting sick and you are sick, vitamin C is not necessarily better while you're sick. It's kind of like it's not doing much at that point, especially if you're doing like lemon. If you're doing lemon teas and stuff like that and you're like acutely sick, in Chinese medicine it actually kind of it goes too far the other way. Your body's wanting to develop a fever, and then you do like all these diaphoretic or fever breaking plants and herbs like ginger and lemon, and you're kind of preventing the body from building that fever, and it can make the virus stick around a little bit longer. The body struggles a little bit. So vitamin C at the very onset, if you're noticing something, that tickle like you mentioned, and then once you're sick, stop the vitamin C and just I do echinacea for sure. Bone set is another one. We have stronger immunostimulant herbs, but those are probably my two go-tos. And then, yeah, symptomatic relief. What about you? What's your favorites?
Echinacea. I love fire cider. Kick that thing out.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, I love that
Elderberry
one.
syrup is super awesome. I feel like this is like one of those, folk kind of things that deserves its place still. Like it's if you start to feel something, take that multiple times a day, little bits multiple times a day, and like you will navigate the sickness a whole lot easier. The thing that I am super interested to talk about is support the body systems or suppress the body symptoms, right? So I think a lot of people, they start to get sick, they take Tylenol, they take, whatever they can to like stamp those symptoms down. But I think once whatever's moved in, you're getting sick, suppression is not going to help you out in the long term. So we tend to like to take things so that we actually don't feel sick, but at a certain point we just have to support the body. I think that's the whole idea with the vitamin C, right? It's like we're no longer trying to stop this process from happening. We're in it, and we sort of just have to let it happen. So yeah, what are your thoughts when you see, in terms of like, I see this a lot with parents, so I want to get your perspective. You get like I don't know, you have your kid come to you and they're feeling sick, they've got a fever. I think a lot of parents' first reactions is to go grab some Tylenol or some Advil, make them feel comfortable. What are your thoughts, and what would you do for your own kiddos?
Totally. And yeah, as a parent, and any parents out there listening to this, like, I sympathize because, especially with my firstborn, every single sickness on my mind, I'm like, is this the big one? Is this the bad one? Is this, and that psychologically, that goes back to me, and like, I won't say my conditioning, but it's my own fear that I'm putting into that versus what's actually happening. My second born, I'm a seasoned parent with our little girl now. But yeah, I did tons of research. Every time Corbin got sick, my little boy, 2 years old, I would read the same stuff over and over again. This is how crazy it would be. Like every sickness, so once a month he would get sick, and I would read the same principles and practices page on fever and safety of fever, and then I would read Aviva Rom's, do this Google search if you're parents, Aviva Rom Children's Fever, and she breaks down exactly what we're talking about, the importance of fevers, and why we would avoid using Advil and Tylenol. Obviously the kids are uncomfortable. We don't like that. But breaking that fever, in a sense, weakens the body's immune response to things. And ultimately, it can cause those viruses to linger around longer. It can open the door for secondary infection. If those viruses are never properly dealt with, then they can cause secondary problems. I think that hasn't been researched fully. But we did give our kids, not Alma, but Corbin, we gave him Advil a couple times, and I immediately saw a difference. And I'll share the experience. He was really uncomfortable. It was more than just fever. His whole body was hurting. You could tell he was only 2. So we gave him Advil, and fever went down. He felt better. But what we saw after that was a rebounding and a much higher fever for 3 or 4 days. So in a sense, we gave space for that virus we broke the fever, which is putting pressure on the virus. And then we got rid of the fever, and that allows the virus to be like, oh, I can get a little break here. I can do a little bit more of what I want to do, replicate, spread, put out my inflammatory markers, and open the door for that virus to have a stronger response next time as soon as the Advil's gone. So breaking fevers is not my thing. And what I'll tell with my research on this is fevers, I'll use Fahrenheit because that's what I know the best. I know a little bit of Celsius with fevers. But 102.7 is very common. Fahrenheit is very common for a fever. It's pretty high, but it's not dangerous by any means whatsoever. 104, that's kind of the threshold. That's when we would say it gets dangerous. And I think that's 40 degrees Celsius if you know Celsius. So, but the body has its own mechanism to downregulate that fever. So that I think they're called pyrons. I could be wrong with what that term is, but the body will build up to this fever. The fever is going to go high, and then these messenger signals reach the hypothalamus and the pituitary, and it tells you're too hot, break the fever, and it automatically downregulates the fever. And you can watch this throughout the night. The kids will get up to, Corbin's got up to 103.7, and then we're like, oh my gosh, we're worried. And then you check it about 15 minutes later, and it's back to 102.7. It drops that full degree. So once it gets to 104, and then it crosses that threshold and keeps climbing, that's when you need diaphoretics. That's when you need to be like, we need to break this fever now. Use Advil, because the real scary part is 107. That's when you're in a point of like doing damage and coma potentially. But that's very rare. That's a serious infection. Not what you're normally seeing with a coronavirus, an influenza virus. To cross that 104 threshold, it can happen, but that's definitely that's where you really need to start being concerned if you're noticing it's not downregulating at that point. So yeah, that's my whole input on Advil. I try to make the kids comfortable. We do baths, and we do cold and flu herbs with them as well. You know, the echinaceas, the lemon balms, because that's nice for their nervous system. But we try to avoid Advil as much as possible, just because it does help them feel better, but it's also weakening their immune system with the immune response.
It's like a temporary feel better kind of thing. Like I
Definitely.
think the way that I think about it is like our body's doing the things for a reason. So I mean, there's interesting conversations going on out there about whether it's the virus that causes it or whether it's whatever it is. So like putting that aside, whatever's going on in your body, it's doing it for a reason. I think our modern Western medical system likes to believe that our bodies are flawed and make mistakes and do things that we don't understand. But really, like your body is, it's, you can think of getting sick like a program. Like it's like a program that your body is running that says something's in me and I don't want it. So, and you can kind of know that because what does your body do when you get sick? You pee more, you poop more, you sweat more, you vomit. Like your body is actively moving things from it, right? Taking something from the inside, putting it to the outside world. So we don't necessarily want to stop these processes because they are programs that the body is running in your favor. So if you stop it at some point, like David mentioned, like if you stop it, you actually tend to see the rebound effect afterwards. So you've paused a program that needs to happen. So now you can't get the positive result. And there's actually been studies, I don't know if you've ever come across this stuff, but there's been studies that have shown that kids have growth spurts after childhood illness. So when they're able to like fully run the program and they're able to like finish, get rid of the cellular debris that the body is actually trying to get rid of, then there's space to actually feel even better than before, to grow better than before, to function better than before. So I love that you take this like no Advil approach and like, you know, with the kids, because it can be maybe easier for us as adults to be like, oh, I'll endure this. But when you see your child in pain, like it's a lot harder to be like, oh, I'm going to let them endure this. So, you know, just to put some parents' minds at rest and, you know, put yourself at ease, like it's a thing that your body is programmed to do. And not every illness is going to turn into something that is out of control. So let the programs run. And then you'll get to see, you know, like you don't have to like be on the zinc 100%. Like you don't have to like hammer your body with all the things. Like I think there's a certain point where like your body is like, no food, thank you. Like you lose your appetite. You just want to lay there and do nothing. Like let your body do that. Don't take the Advil and push through. Like let your body do what it's asking to do, which is rest, and then get rid of whatever's inside of it.
That's a really cool point with the study you said, because I've never heard of that study, but it's an absolute observation that I've seen with Corbin when he was, you know, I mean, he's a baby. He's like 1 going on to 2. He would get sick, and then we would see a huge spurt with his talking and his communication or his coordination. Those things, it was night and day. You could see it after the cold and flu, and I've heard it from other parents too. So that's really cool that there's even a study to kind of reaffirm those anecdotal observations that we have.
Yeah, super cool. So some things that maybe we don't do during acute illness. What are your thoughts on adaptogens? So we talked about like astragalus and whatever being a great preventative. What are your thoughts? Because I feel like there's a little bit of controversy out there on this of like adaptogens or no during sickness.
Yeah, I mean, my training was no adaptogens while sick. It's partially energetic, which we did a podcast ago. The last podcast was about energetics. Partially energetic in traditional Chinese medicine that adaptogens give energy. They give qi to the body, and if you're sick, they can give qi to the invader. However, Stephen Buhner is a herbalist, very well-known, accredited herbalist, and he put out a whole protocol herbally, and I think he even used supplements in there as well, but for sure herbally on how to approach SARS-CoV-2 with herbs, and astragalus is on his acute formula. So there is definitely different information out there. What about you? How do you feel when you do those?
I tend to stick to that like energetic feel. So like we just say, like, don't suppress it. I think when the body is asking to lay down and rest, you don't necessarily need to give it the things that are going to give you vitality. Like, I think that's the whole point of stressing the prevention, is so that it's like before you get sick, you've got that vitality in the body, so that when you do get sick, then you can just let the body run the program, and you can rest and take that time to just clear it out and recover. So yeah, I tend to stay away from them, just because, I mean, one, it was something that I was taught, and two, like, energetically, it just makes sense to me that we, yeah, I see sickness as a breaking down process. So like your fever goes up, and it's because your body is actively denaturing proteins or breaking down cells. So like, why would we do the things that fortify the cells or like fortify the body when it's actually trying to kind of break down stuff? So it's like the difference between like an anabolic and catabolic state, right? Like, definitely, before we get sick, we want to build, we want to increase the vitality, essentially, and then when we get sick, we want to let the catabolic process happen. And that's I mean, it's not necessarily to say that that's the only way to do things. I totally respect other herbalists that do other things, but that's sort of the way that I see and approach my own health. And there's so many tools. There's so many tools out there that we don't necessarily need the astragalus when we're actually sick. Like, we can lean on more supporting what the body's trying to do. So if you have, for example, like a sore throat or a dry cough, we can moisten that up and support those mucous membranes. And that's not going to stop any processes, but it's going to support the body's ability to, have well-functioning lungs to clear stuck, gunky stuff out. And so the same is true if you're like very congested and mucousy. We're not going to dry that up. We're going to actually just support the body's removal of that. So there's like so many other tools that we can use that we don't have to necessarily lean on adaptogens and whatever in the acute phase of an illness.
Totally. I mean, what you're literally saying is like the yin and yang balance. So prior to getting sick, we want to do the yin. We want to like build and move and encourage, and then the yang is the more rest and relax and let the processes take place. We don't want to constantly just be doing yin all the time. That's the state of the world we're in, right? Like, it's always just go, go, go. Especially when we're sick, we need to just go inward and purge, if you will. It's a purge.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The yin and the yang, that's a perfect example. Just because something is good for you doesn't mean it's good for you 100% of the time. So I think my philosophy is, find the balance and different tools for different phases. So I definitely wanted to chat like super quickly about the recovery, but I know you have to go. So what are your thoughts? Do you want to save that for another time? Or we can maybe 5 minutes.
Why don't you maybe give us an intro, and we can do a whole nother section on it. Like, give us an intro on like recovery, some of the definitions that we're dealing with out there that's new and not new necessarily. But yeah, why don't you give us an intro, and I think that we can do a whole podcast on that aspect, really.
Okay, that sounds good. So I think recovery is a super important part of this process, and I think we often forget about that. Like, when I was in school was the first time I had heard the word convalescence, and that is essentially the process of building back up after the sickness. So like we were just talking about, like, if sickness is a breakdown process, then there has to be some level of rebuild, and just returning to work as soon as possible, or returning to your daily activities and like going full force as soon as possible isn't necessarily going to benefit you in the long run. It's like if you have an injury, like you have to rehab the injury. So imagine a sickness as like a full body injury, and you have to rehab it so that, slowly introduce things, get more nutrients back in the body, rebuild the cells that you broke down and lost. So there's a whole discussion around long haul COVID now and what that means. And I think it's great that we can maybe give more space to this conversation in another podcast, because it's been a big deal, and it's been almost like a scary thing for people. It's like they don't want to catch COVID because long haul COVID is such a common thing. But ultimately, post-viral fatigue is not new. It's been around for forever. If you've ever had like mono in your lifetime, you'll know it's a thing. Like that's like where post-viral fatigue has been the most common. It's been around for forever. So just because it's associated with this illness doesn't mean that you're going to get it. It doesn't mean that it has to be a scary thing, because there are ways through this, and it becomes a lot easier when you actually focus on having a convalescence phase. So some of the terms that we're seeing now come out with an association with long haulers is like histamine intolerance or mast cell activation. So these are when your immune system gets like hypersensitized after an illness. So it's almost like PTSD for the immune system. It's like you become on high alert all the time. And it's not necessary. Like you're no longer in danger, but your body acts like it is. So there are definitely ways that people can navigate this, regaining your strength, regaining nutrient status, and then if you happen to get into that like mast cell activation stage and you're really having like these long like fatigue symptoms, there's totally support for you. And it actually, a lot of it goes back to those preventative type herbs that are educating the immune system on where we want it to be, and just sort of supporting the body in that way. So I'll leave it there, unless do you have anything else you wanted to add to that?
I would just add how common it is we're seeing come through the conversation starting to come through the clinic a lot. I mean, I would say in the last month I've just told people, hey, reach out to Kristin, because first of all, she's done all the research on mast cell activation prior to all this, so she has the study, the know-how, but now it's becoming so common because of long COVID. So we've seen, I would say, 4 people that have come in asking questions about that. So reach out to Kristin if this is something that's on your radar, post-jab, post-viral, whatever it is. The knowledge is there. She has it. I'm learning tons off of this. It's pretty new for me, and I've heard of mast cell activation. I have the generic herbs, but I totally think we should do just a whole podcast on this alone, because it's a big subject, and it's there's a lot of misinformation that goes around out there, and we saw it with the whole coronavirus thing over the past 2 years. But I think it would be beneficial for our listeners to hear kind of mostly what your research has pulled up and your approach and your techniques. And
Yeah, we'll have to do a podcast in the future on that. I think it is important for people to know. It's actually only recently that I'm seeing people, like the general public, have these terms in their vocabulary. So it's kind of interesting, but like mast cell activation and histamine intolerance, it goes way, way beyond post-viral fatigue or post-viral syndrome. So definitely worth chatting about. And it's an area that I'm very passionate about learning, because these are the people who tend to come in with like knowing these terms. They've been sick for a really long time and they're not getting answers. So it's something I really care about sharing the information on, so that people can get better and get the answers they're looking for. Okay, so let's wrap up there. If you liked this podcast, please share this with someone who might find it interesting or maybe needs to hear some of this. If you'd like to work more closely with us, we both offer one-on-one consultations where we discuss your personal story in depth and work to uncover and address the underlying causes of your illness. So you can connect with us through our websites or our emails, which are linked down below in the description. And you can find David on Instagram at errant underscore, what is it? Errant Empire Herbal, is that right?
Yeah, errant underscore her. Oh, I don't know.
I think it's errant underscore herb. No, errant. We both did it. Errant underscore empire underscore herbal. I think that is your tag. I am at Functional Herbalist. And hopefully the next time we're on this, we are doing a little follow-up to this on recovery, rebuilding. Maybe that's where we get to talk about mast cell activation and all that cool stuff. So yeah, thanks for listening, everybody, and see you next time.